Just Richard II, in a couple of sentences, give us some sense of his personality. I mean, he's only 14 years old, but he's a very bright boy. He has an elevated sense of himself, doesn't he?
Very elevated, yeah.
Do we know much about his character at this point?
We know that he is very conscious of his dignity as king. We know that he is very smart, and we know that he is very brave. But we also know that he is untested.
Right.
That, he is only 14.
Yeah.
And the question of how much agency he has in what follows is contested because we just don't know. However, I suspect that he probably has more agency than he would have done in a situation where the royal government is still cohering. Because it becomes clear that day that London gets taken by the rebels that actually Richard's advisors have no idea really what to do. So they try and get the rebels to disperse by offering a general pardon. And this doesn't work because the rebels say they won't until serfdom has been abolished, until the traitors in the Tower have been handed over. And since the traitors in the Tower are basically the royal government, they're stuck. They're not quite sure what to do. And so they stand there and they watch as the fires spread and more of their kind of, their manors and their properties are destroyed. And so as dust starts to fall, the mayor, William Walworth, who is very punchy, he suggests that they should get all the troops they can and sally out from the Tower. He says that these people aren't soldiers, we can destroy them. But there are very proficient military figures in the Tower with Richard, of whom the most experienced soldier is the Earl of Salisbury, a veteran of the 100 Years' War, and he says, no, don't do it. We haven't got enough. We haven't got enough men. And we risk two things. We risk an absolute bloodbath, and we risk the possibility that we won't be able to prevail. And so by the next morning, Richard's councillors have decided that they have no choice but to allow the king to go out and negotiate.
The one thing they didn't previously want to do, right?
The one thing they didn't previously want to do. And the question is, are they sending Richard out to negotiate in good faith or not? I think the councillors almost certainly are not. I mean, of course they're not, because they face probably being lynched if they, if the rebels have their way. But I think maybe for Richard, maybe it's different, because he is by now very aware that the rebels have a strong personal devotion to him. And if you're a king and you're 14 years old, I mean, this is quite invigorating. So anyway, he gets on his horse and he rides out with his trusted advisors, people who will not serve as red rags to the bull, Dominic, that is the mass of peasants.
He's staring down the barrel again, isn't he, Tom?
Yeah. So Richard rides out to Mile End, and there he meets with Wat Tyler and kind of several hundred other of the rebels gathered around him. And the rebels complain to the king of their intolerable servitude, the phrase is, and the heavy oppressions. And Richard hears them, and he says he has, he understands their unhappiness, and he agrees to startling terms, which, if they had been upheld, would have, radically altered the social fabric of England. So he agrees that, yes, serfdom shall be abolished, which is clearly a very radically egalitarian move. But at the same time, he also agrees to a kind of bonfire of the regulations, Dominic. Supply side reforms.
The Daily Telegraph
abolition.
would love it.
So all the kind of the monopolies, the tolls, the trading privileges that the various merchants in various towns, including London, the abbeys, the monasteries, have habitually exercised. It's agreed that all these will be destroyed, that from this point on, commoners will have the right to trade as and where they please. It's a very, very radical free market maneuver. So it's simultaneously egalitarian and very free market, these negotiations. What Richard doesn't agree to, as far as we can tell, despite the chronicle that you read saying that he does, is that the traitors, in inverted commas, should be handed over. But I think it's equally clear that in the eyes of the rebels who've been negotiating with him, this is essentially what Richard has agreed to. And so After the meeting, Richard doesn't go back to the Tower. We're not quite sure where he goes, but he definitely doesn't go back to the Tower. But the great mass of rebels who had been with him, they all head off towards the Tower, and they get in. So this is the only time in the entire history of the Tower of London that it gets forcibly,
they get in because there's no defences.
Gets forcibly captured.
Because Richard has withdrawn the defences, conceivably?
We don't know how they get in. It's very strange because the Tower, it's impregnable. There's no way that they would have been able to force it. So I think the likelihood is, and it's a reflection of the fact that this isn't really, again, a peasants' revolt. They have, there are people at the head of the rebels, probably in London. I mean, probably very, very eminent, distinguished figures who smooth talk their way in. They're talking to the guards. They say, "We've come from the king." He says, "You've got to let us in." And so they break in. And again, the violence is very targeted. So in fact, only 5 people are executed. Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, you'd expect him. It takes 8 blows of the axe to chop off his head. Robert Hales, the treasurer. John Legg, the upskirter pursuivant.
Right.
He goes.
Yeah.
A lawyer from Stepney.
Right.
Who has clearly been targeted by some other, probably lawyer from Stepney. He's, clearly been fingered, and, so that's some kind of local vendetta. And then the son of John of Gaunt, Henry, who people remember, we said he was in the Tower. He manages to get away. A rebel from Rochester is supposed to have bundled him out, which is very sensible because in due course the rebel is able to use this as a justification for why he shouldn't be put to death. But instead, the rebels, they vent their hatred for John of Gaunt on his physician, whom they find there.
That's harsh, isn't it? Just the guy's just doing his job. Hippocratic oath, Tom.
Yeah, well, you'd say so. So anyway, so this is the state of play midway through this turbulent day on which the King of England has had negotiations with rebel leaders from Essex and from Kent. And the question now is, will it work? Will the rebels disperse? What's going to happen?
Probably apart from the fact that this revolution, had it happened, would have completely reshaped English society. I mean, that thing about Henry Bolingbroke being bundled out by the bloke from Rochester, that is a momentous moment in English history, isn't it? If he had been captured and executed, the fate of Richard II, the fate of the Plantagenet dynasty, the whole course of English history might well have been very different.